On November 27, 2024, on a busy street in downtown, an unimaginable event was about to unfold. The sky was clear, the sun warm, and cars continued to drive by as usual. But in the midst of this peaceful setting, a woman, who would soon be referred to as Karen, was gearing up for a confrontation with the authorities. From her shiny SUV, she was ready to share her dramatic tale with the officer. And no one could have predicted that what seemed to be a minor fender-bender would escalate into a comical and ironic legal battle. "Officer, someone threw a bottle at my car and broke my tail light. I'm just minding my own business, driving downtown, and this happens," she reports dramatically, her high-pitched tone making it sound as though she were the leading actress in a soap opera. Her eyes burned with indignation as she waved her hands wildly, as though hoping the people around her could feel the injustice she was enduring. In reality, it was a small accident caused by someone's carelessness, yet Karen transformed it into a grand, heroic struggle against the world. Each word she spoke was emphasized, her gestures exaggerated, as though she were on stage before millions of viewers, setting the tone for a drama that had just begun. "I'm not a criminal. I've never stolen anything, never," she continues, her hands flailing dramatically as though every word were an accusation toward anyone who dared to disagree with her. Her eyes gleamed with outrage, and her mouth hardly paused for breath, as if repeating her innocence one more time would clear her name. She clearly wanted the officer to understand. She was a good person, completely blameless, and this incident was nothing but a tragic misunderstanding. Each word she spoke carried an unwavering certainty, as if she were being tried in a criminal case, not merely addressing a minor traffic issue. Her tone resembled that of a broken record, endlessly repeating the same message: "I'm innocent. I've done nothing wrong. Someone owes me an apology." She not only wanted to clear her name, but also hoped for an official apology for what she perceived as an unjust situation. But instead of calming the situation, she created a tense and uncomfortable atmosphere, casting herself as a victim in an ongoing, nameless war. She was not just defending herself, she was expecting others to validate her outrage, even though no one had truly wronged her. As the officer listens patiently, Karen suddenly shifts to an unrelated rant about a traumatic experience she had at a local store. "I just wanted to buy a bottle of wine. Just one bottle, and they harassed me." Harassed? She shrieks, each word sharp and dripping with exaggerated emotion, as though she were being accused of a serious crime. Her voice is high-pitched and full of distress, making every mention of the incident sound like an open wound that has never healed. She describes the situation as though she had faced a severe violation of her rights, an event so incomprehensible that no one could possibly fathom it. "What was the issue, you ask?" A store employee had dared to ask her for ID when she tried to buy a bottle of wine. Yes, simply because she had reached an age where it was necessary to prove her legal ability to purchase alcohol. But for Karen, this request was an unforgivable affront. "How old do you think I am for them to do that to me? I'm not a child," she complains, completely unaware that she is completely missing the point in her own reasoning. Even more, Karen continued to exaggerate the situation, accusing the store of ruining her honor. She insisted that she had done nothing wrong, but because of the unbearable humiliation, she had been banned from a place she would likely never return to anyway. "It's their fault, not mine," she declared, like someone wronged, pleading for justice, even though the situation could have been resolved easily if she had simply accepted the store's reasonable request. The woman handed over her ID to the officer as if this was a crucial step to prove her innocence, that she deserved to be treated fairly. However, despite the document now in the officer's hands, she could not suppress the feeling of injustice building inside her. This wave of emotion seemed unstoppable, to the point where she forgot the real reason for providing her ID: to prove her identity, not to continue portraying herself as a wronged hero. She looked at the officer with disappointment in her eyes, as though he had committed an unforgivable crime, instead of trying to do his job. "Just because of a broken tail light, I have to go through all this. It's me. Don't you see?" she continued, her voice soaked in drama and almost in tears. She felt like a forgotten character in a tragic film, where everyone ignored her suffering, only seeing an innocent name unjustly condemned. Though the ID she provided was meant to help resolve the situation, for Karen, it seemed like just another part of the larger play she had created in her mind. She had lost sight of the true purpose of cooperating with the officer. to establish her identity and allow for a logical resolution. Instead, she continued to build the image of herself as a victim, someone so cornered that she had to prove she deserved fair treatment. All she saw was an injustice piling on top of herself, without realizing that she actually had the opportunity to clarify things through cooperation. While the officer just wanted to do his job gathering information and resolving the situation, Karen kept escalating everything, as if this conversation was a battle to reclaim her dignity and rights. The ID, which should have been a simple tool for verifying her identity, had now become a symbol of unreasonable resistance, making the situation far more complicated than it needed to be. She kept insisting that this was a serious violation of her rights, even though there was nothing serious about the situation. "This is ridiculous. People are always calling the cops on me, and I'm not a criminal. I'm just living my life. Why does everyone think I'm a criminal?" she yelled, shaking her head in anger, as though the officer in front of her was responsible for all the suffering she had endured. She uttered these words with a tone as if everyone around her was part of a conspiracy to bring her down, making her feel like a victim in a grand game she couldn't escape from. With every word she spoke, it became clearer that Karen not only didn't understand why the police were present, but also felt like she was being treated unfairly, even though she hadn't done anything to help with the investigation process. Her voice was filled with outrage, not because she was worried about what had happened to her car, but because she was too focused on justifying her actions and proving her innocence. In Karen's eyes, the arrival of the police was not an opportunity to clarify the situation, but part of a dark campaign against her. Her words echo endlessly, repeating the mantra of "I'm not a criminal," as if that was the only thing that mattered. The officer attempted to inspect the damage to her car, hoping to clarify the situation and determine the cause, but Karen had no intention of cooperating. She stared at him with suspicion and frustration, feeling like every move the officer made was an unnecessary intrusion into her life. "Why am I being detained? I didn't do anything wrong," she shouted, becoming increasingly hostile, as though being stopped and checked was such an awful violation that it couldn't be forgiven. The crime Karen was accused of wasn't anything serious, a small crack in the tail light, but in her eyes, it was clearly a serious offense, worthy of imprisonment. The contrast between the severity of the situation and her reaction only highlighted her excessive emotional response. As tension grew, she seemed unable to understand that the officer's purpose was not to accuse her, but simply to investigate the situation and determine the cause and extent of the damage. She couldn't recognize that the officer's steps were meant to protect both parties' rights, not to show unfair treatment toward her. Instead, all Karen focused on was defending her image, insisting that she didn't deserve to be treated like a criminal, despite there being no evidence to suggest that she actually was one. The officer, with remarkable calmness, continued to examine the taillight and the surrounding area as if this was an unavoidable part of his job. Meanwhile, Karen refused to stand still, hovering around him, pointing at random spots on the ground as if some hidden magic lay there. "That's not even where the bottle landed. Why are you wasting my time?" she yelled, looking at him suspiciously, as if the officer was intentionally bothering her rather than doing his job. Her over-the-top reaction only made the situation more absurd, especially since she was the one who had called the police in the first place. The officer's expression remained unchanged, his patience unwavering, a quality only someone who had witnessed countless situations like this could maintain. If he hadn't kept his composure, he might have shouted, "Lady, you're the one who called us." Instead, he quietly went about his job, while Karen continued to create the small chaos she imagined was at the heart of the problem. Each move of the officer was meticulous and careful, as if every inspection could reveal a part of the truth that Karen seemed unwilling to admit. Meanwhile, Karen continued to ramble incessantly, staring at him with a look of dissatisfaction. She seemed unaware that what the officer was doing was simply verifying the damage she had reported, but in her mind, it was all just a meaningless waste of time. As time passed, Karen's frustration only grew. "This is harassment, pure harassment. Do you have nothing better to do?" she shouted, her tone implying that the officer was personally inconveniencing her. Her question was filled with anger, as though the officer were responsible for everything around her, including the strange decisions she had made. She continued to act as if the officer's sole purpose was to disrupt her life, and everything he was doing was designed to waste her time. In reality, Karen's excessive reaction not only added to the absurdity of the situation, it also highlighted the contradictions in how she perceived herself and the world around her. Karen failed to realize that, in theory, she was the one who had called the police for help. It was her, not the officer, who had initiated this encounter. However, in Karen's worldview, everything had to revolve around her. Being bothered by an officer simply doing his job seemed completely unacceptable. The image of a woman ready to claim harassment, and she was the one causing the trouble, was a stark reflection of her lack of self-awareness and a deeply skewed perception of the situation. Karen's frustration deepened as she felt the officer's efforts to verify the damage to her car were an unforgivable insult. She continued to exaggerate everything, believing that every moment the officer spent inspecting was a personal invasion, even though he was just doing the job she had requested. She was increasingly losing her ability to objectively assess the situation, and now everything around her felt personal and unacceptable. The officer, patient and meticulous, continued to piece together the details in an attempt to pinpoint exactly where and when the bottle had hit Karen's car. He repeated his questions, seeking specific information to complete his task. However, Karen refused to cooperate. She wasn't sure where the bottle had fallen or why it had caused a small crack in the tail light. But the only thing she was certain of was that it was absolutely not her fault. Each of her answers was an evasion, a tactic to avoid taking responsibility. In reality, for Karen, the issue wasn't whether she was wrong, but rather that the officer couldn't anticipate everything, as if he should be able to read her mind. She kept making excuses, blaming the officer for not elevating his investigative powers. "Why are you asking me so many questions? You should just know what happened," she yelled, her expression as if the officer was tormenting her. To Karen, not understanding everything around her was a personal failure of the officer. In her mind, he wasn't just a simple worker, but someone who had made her feel like she was being interrogated, as though she were guilty. She was losing her composure, and instead of providing more information, she only worsened the situation. The officer, sensing the potential for further tension, calmly explained again, "We're not accusing you of anything. We're just trying to establish the facts and timeline of events," he said, with almost infinite patience. However, Karen not only didn't understand but felt challenged. "I don't care what you think. I know I didn't do anything wrong," she shouted, her voice ringing with a firm declaration. Even though the officer had repeatedly stated that he wasn't accusing her, Karen refused to accept the truth. In her mind, everything was clear. She was innocent, and the officer was the one who didn't understand. While the officer was simply trying to uncover the truth, Karen continued to be consumed by her irrational anger. She looked at him as though every action he took was a provocation, as if his job was to prove she wasn't guilty, even though no one had asked her to do so. Karen's outrage stemmed from feeling violated by the questions, while the officer was merely doing his job, analyzing the situation and verifying the information. The most striking aspect was the stark contradiction in Karen's reaction. She refused to accept the officer's help, but she couldn't understand that he needed clear information to determine exactly what had happened. Instead, Karen responded with criticism and frustration, as if she were being stripped of the freedom and respect she thought she deserved. Even though the officer had repeatedly stated there was no accusation, Karen's insistence didn't lessen. She created a facade for herself, shifting all responsibility onto others, and couldn't accept that she could be at fault, even in a small situation like this. By now, Karen had become a broken record, endlessly repeating her meaningless justifications. She kept asserting her innocence, continually denying everything that was happening, as though repeating it 1,000 times would make the truth change. "I'm not cooperating. Why should I?" she screamed, her eyes wide open, hands raised as if performing in some courtroom drama. She looked at the officer as if this was the final scene of a famous movie, and she was the lead character in a fierce battle where she had to win to protect her honor. It seemed she believed everyone around her was watching her shine, but unfortunately, no one was there to support her in this role. The officer showed no signs of succumbing to Karen's performance, and everything had gone beyond her control. And then, something happened, an event no one could have foreseen. The officer, who had been patient throughout his interaction with Karen, began to feel the rising tension. He had tried every possible way to stay calm, explaining gently that everything was just an investigation and no one was accusing her. But when Karen realized that all her efforts were in vain, she lost control. In a spontaneous act, she angrily spat in the officer's face. This moment was not a trivial one. It reflected Karen's level of desperation, as she was willing to cross all moral boundaries just to assert her power. It was a turning point. This action, though small physically, was a huge shock, confronting her with a serious charge, assaulting a police officer. Immediately, Karen's action led to an inevitable consequence. In the blink of an eye, the officer began to carry out the arrest. "You can't do this. I have my rights. This is a violation of my rights." Karen screamed, growing increasingly confused and frantic. She struggled in the arms trying to control her, as if she were in a wrestling match she couldn't win. At this moment, everything became chaotic and out of control. She was not just facing one charge, but also the crime of resisting arrest with violence. Her resistance to being arrested only made the situation worse. In this moment, Karen was no longer a victim in her own story. She was the perpetrator, and all the previous justifications were nothing but futile pleas. A video of this incident, recorded by a bystander, not only reflected the tense situation, but also provided a satirical look at how people sometimes become overly defensive in protecting their personal dignity. A gentle comment on the patience and professionalism of the police force was added to emphasize the reality that sometimes those who refuse to cooperate with reality can never be convinced. Finally, one of the officers, though tired and somewhat exhausted, maintained the necessary composure. He shared an emotional story from his career, in which he had arrested a person for throwing a bottle of alcohol at someone. "Once, I arrested a guy because he threw a bottle at someone. He was so angry, and he couldn't understand that his actions had violated the law. And now I see, I can do nothing more than fulfill my duty." This sharing served as a gentle reminder that those working in this field need not only patience, but also the understanding that not everyone is ready to face the truth fairly. Ultimately, Karen's story serves as a lesson in patience and respect for social rules. Despite her frustration and impatience, her actions not only escalated the situation, but also led to serious consequences. Through this, we see that in every situation, especially when faced with injustice or the feeling of being misunderstood, maintaining calm and following procedure is crucial. Authorities, like the police, may sometimes deal with difficult individuals, but they must always maintain professionalism, patience, and determination. The takeaway here is not just the need for cooperation, but also a reminder that, in every conversation, listening and respecting others is key to maintaining peace and avoiding undesirable outcomes.